Hi, in this video, we're going to do a demo walkthrough of how to create outputs within your DataForge workspace. And if you're not familiar with the concept of an output, it's essentially a target schema that you can define that allows you to map your sources to the output and then have the output actually write or publish the data out to external systems. So in this video, we're going to do a few different examples. We're going to use different connections to create files within S3. We're going to write tables to both Snowflake and Databricks. And then we're going to update some of the outputs to use additional parameters, filters, and settings that you may want to use within your workspace. So if we get started within our DataForge workspace, the first thing that I'm going to do is open our connections, and we're going to quickly review the output connections I already have created. So we'll sort our connection direction here, and we can see all the different output connections that we already have. The first one that we're going to use is this S3 output. So it's just going to allow us to actually create and write files to an S3 bucket. So if we look at our settings here, we've got the connection direction as output. We got the type as file, the storage technology as AWS S3. We've got our file path as the data lake bucket. And then because we're using the data lake bucket, we can set our cloud credentials to use the instance profile option. However, if we were writing to a different bucket or folder, if you will, that our instance profile didn't have access to, we would want to set it up with access keys. Or for example, if we were writing to Azure, we would set it up with the account name and account key and the container name. So if we switch back here, this is essentially our setup for the output connection for a file. The next connection that we're going to use is actually Snowflake here. So when we open this up, we again see our direction as output, see the type as table this time, and our driver as Snowflake. And then in the connection parameters, when you expand this dropdown, you would be able to set up all the authentication and different parameters for how we're actually going to connect, where we're going to connect, etc. So we would have the host, the user, the password, etc. The last connection that we're going to use in this example is going to be a Databricks catalog. So we're going to use this Unity test catalog that we have in here. And we're essentially going to write a delta table out to Databricks. So again, we see our direction as output, the connection type as table, our driver is Delta Lake, credentials are implicit with our Databricks workspace. And then if we expand the connection parameters, the primary parameter that we need to worry about is the catalog that we're setting up when you're using the Delta Lake output. So in this case, we're writing to a Unity catalog called Unity Test. However, we could write to the Hive Metastore, we could write to other Unity catalogs, etc. But this is where you're going to define that. And then when we get to the output creation, we're going to define our database or schema name and then our table name. So that's just a quick overview of the different connections that we're going to use. If we jump to our sources, just for a little bit of context on the example, we're going to primarily use three different sources. We'll use sales order detail, we'll use sales order header, and then lastly, we'll use customer. And sales order header, customer, very straightforward sources, no rules. If we open sales order detail, there's a couple different just basic rules that I've already created. So we have a test rule that's an enrichment here. And then we have a validation rule that basically checks if each record has an order quantity greater than 1. And so we'll incorporate this into our output as well, which is why I bring this up. So let's get started with creating a new output, and let's actually start with the file output first. So we'll open outputs from the main menu, we'll create new, and then let's give this a name. So we'll call it sales header file output. Or actually, let's call it data file. Really clever naming here. And then we'll give it a description, so just demo for this purpose. Our output type we're going to select as file. And then we're going to select the connection that we already created. And then we're going to set our file type. So I'm going to use CSV in this example. And then we'll use file name. And in the file name, we can actually also include an extension of the connection file path. So for example, in the connection, we were looking at the output, the data lake bucket. However, if I look at my data lake bucket here, you can actually see that we have a folder that I created that's just called output within the data lake. So in our file name for the output, I'm actually going to reference this and the file name that I want to use. So what that'll look like is I can just put the subfolder and then a slash, and then we'll actually use come up with the file name that we want to use. So every time the output runs, it's going to create a file named test file. Again, really good naming. but basic for us, that's all we need. And then the last parameter that I'm going to use in here is just a single file setting right here. So all this does is basically forces the output to create one file with all my data as opposed to a multi-part file, which is typical with like a Parquet, etc. So we're just going to leave it as single file just for this example. So that'll bring us to our mapping tab here. And this is a pretty important page. So once we've got the settings set up to say where we want to write the output to, the mapping is really going to be our source to output, our source to target mapping. And so in here, we're essentially defining a target schema for the output. And so what we're going to do to start is add a source. So we're going to add the source mapping. And this is really, again, the tie from source to output. So how should the data be mapped? And so we'll select our source in here. And this is also referred to within DataForge as a channel. So you'll commonly hear that and see that across DataForge. And again, the channel is really the source mapping, the tie from source to target. So now that we've added that source mapping in here, we're going to use the channel menu here. And we're just going to get a kind of a quick start. We're going to keep it really basic and use that add all source columns. And so that option actually creates a unique column for every attribute from the source. So whether that's raw attributes or rules, they will all get automatically added here. And you'll notice that each column up top here has a name and then also a data type detected. So all of this can be modified within the column menu here. And let's just take a quick scroll. Everything looks good. So what we can do is we'll just keep this really simple, and we're going to actually reset this output so that it runs and creates our file. So there's two places that we can do that. The first being on this channel menu, and we'll just kick it off here while we're here. And so we can see that that already got initiated. It's starting. So let's open up the source itself where we can actually see that process running. Now the other place that we could have reset the output is either on the input level, we could use reset output, or on the header level here, we can use the reset options here as well. And on the header menu, we would actually have multiple options. So if this source were mapped to many different outputs at the same time, we could use the reset all channels option. And so it would rewrite the data from this source to each output that it's mapped to, or we could individually just reset that one channel similar to what we did from the output page. So we can see that that output was successful. So let's take a look at our process here. We can see some previous runs that I've been playing around with, but this latest reset is what we're looking at. So again, we can view a couple different things within here. We can certainly look at the record counts, so how many records were actually written out in that output. We can look at the output logs. Not super helpful in this case, but certainly helpful in some scenarios. And then we can also look at the output parameters. And so one really nice thing about output parameters is you can actually see the output query that's going to run as part of the process. So we can see that up top here. And then we can also see that target schema that we defined in that output mapping page. And then there's a bunch of additional parameters we can use as well, just depending on the need. Okay, so now that we know that that ran successfully, we'll just take a quick look at our data lake and our output bucket, and we can see that that test file.csv was created, in fact, so that's awesome. Our output worked, we set everything up correctly. What we'll do is go back to DataForge and let's start creating a different type of output. So we did file. Let's now do an output to Snowflake. So we'll call this Snowflake. We'll call it sales ag. So we're actually going to make this an aggregate output, just so that you kind of have an example of how that works. We'll add the description in here. Our output type, we're going to leave as table. Our connection, we're going to select that Snowflake connection. And then we're going to add in our table names here and schema name. And so for table name, I'm just going to call it total sales. And then for the schema, I'm going to set it as the public schema. And again, we could review the parameters, make sure there's nothing that we want to change, but everything here looks good. So we're going to save this and let's start working on our mapping for this output. So we'll start with our source mapping. And in this case, we're going to reference the sales order detail source here. And within here, actually, we're just going to leave all these other settings as is for now. So we'll say save here. And then rather than using the channel to add all source columns, more often than not, you're probably going to want a very specific set of columns within your output. So what we're going to do is we're going to just start adding new columns in here. And so we will add 2 columns in this example. Oops. We'll call the first one sales order detail ID and save this. And we can see that that new column gets added as essentially a placeholder. And you notice that it does not have a data type detected in here. However, when we start mapping attributes from our source to this column, it will actually detect a data type. But let's add one more column in here and just call this total sales and save that. And so now we can see we basically got 2 columns defined in our output target schema here. And what we're going to do is actually just click into each box so that we can map an attribute into the column here. So the first one here, we'll click in the box, and then similar to rule syntax, we can use the open bracket to reference attributes from sources that are related to sales order detail, or we can reference this, which we're going to do in this example. And then we're going to select the sales order detail ID, and you'll notice that that data type gets brought over, so it's an int. So we'll save that, and then you'll notice the column actually gets updated with the data type as well. And if we needed to ever change the data types, etc., that can be done in the column setting here, the column menu. So we can see in view edit details, we actually see that data type listed in here. So we're going to leave it as is, but that's how you change it. And now the next field we're going to reference is line total. So we'll add that in there. Again, you can see it gets referenced as a number, so DataForge will also correctly map data types depending on the target system. So in Snowflake, it'll be a number. And now the next thing that we want to do, like I mentioned earlier, we're going to make this an aggregate. So rather than just one for one writing every record from this source to the Snowflake output table, we actually want to aggregate this data. So I want to say basically I want to sum all of my line total to be total sales. And I want to group it by the sales order detail ID. So how this works is we open the channel menu, and then you can see the operation type here, which we can select as aggregate, and then we'll save that. And so we know it's an aggregate based on this icon here. And then what we're going to do is we're going to add an aggregate function to any field that we want to actually aggregate. And then any field that does not have an aggregate function will essentially be included in our group by statement within our query. So if we open the line total mapping back up here, 2 ways to do this. One is you just use the drop down and select your aggregate function, or you could type it into your expression. You also have an option to choose whether to use distinct or not. We're going to leave that off, but we're going to save this now. And so we can see that an aggregate function gets added into our mapping. And then like I said, we're going to leave the aggregate off of our sales order detail ID so that it actually groups by that field. So again, you could have many different columns in here, and you could have many different fields getting aggregated or many different fields being in your group. But that's essentially how it works, is you add that aggregate or you leave it off depending on how you want it to work, basically. So this example is all done. Let's go ahead and reset the channel output again. And let's take a look at our source and wait for that to finish running. Okay, great. So it looks like our output completed successfully. So let's head over to Snowflake so that we can check the results. Okay, so I've got my query. If I run this, great. So we can see the table here. We see a number of different system columns, which you can identify or tell by the S underscore in front of them. And you'll notice that a lot of them are null. Totally fine. Don't have to worry about it. They're just included by default depending on the source and the output configuration. So DataForge will detect what you have set up and include the correct information. But however, we do see our 2 pieces of information that we included in our target schema. So we've got our sales order detail ID, and then we have that sum of the line total to make up our total sales in here. So again, successful output, everything worked. Now let's take a look at our outputs again, and let's start creating a new output. So we go back to DataForge here, and we'll click back to outputs. And now the last output that we're going to create is probably the most common kind of format that you're going to follow when you create outputs within your DataForge workspace. However, we're going to get started here, and this one will actually be pointed at Databricks. We're going to create a delta table. And for the name, we're just going to call it OBT sales data. And just some context on the OBT portion, we're going to be following a one big table format. So rather than essentially following more of like a star schema, we're going to use one big table to essentially map multiple sources into the same output so that when we're creating reports in our downstream reporting layer, it's extremely easy to just basically point it to our one big table. And then we can just filter and kind of mix and match what data we actually need to use. So again, definitely a very common approach within DataForge. However, the star schema, any other methodology is always possible within DataForge. This is just typically what I like to use. So if we finish out our settings here, we go to output type, we're going to leave it as table. We'll select the connection. So in this case, we're going to use that Unity catalog output connection for Unity tests. And then in here, we're going to define the table name and table schema. And so for the table name, I'm just going to call it OBT sales. And for table schema, I'm going to call it default, or it's using the default schema. And then let's check our parameters one more time. Everything looks good. Let's save this. And now let's start adding our source mappings. So again, similar setup. We're going to start with our sales order detail here. We'll just save our source map, and we're going to add all source columns from this channel. And then we'll add a couple more sources to our channel list here. So the next one we're going to use is sales order header. Save that. And you'll notice that as we add more source mappings or channels, DataForge will automatically map any fields that are identical naming and include the data type in there. So let's add one more source mapping in here that's going to be customer, and save this. Again, we can see that we get that auto map. If we click to the next page, we can see more of the fields here. And now what I actually want to do is it's nice that I have this information. What I want to do is actually add a few more columns just to tie all of our data together. So what I'm going to do is actually add the customer ID as a column. And one quick note while we're doing this, nothing's stopping me from doing the add all source columns on the other channels as well. I just have something in mind that I want to build, but that's certainly another option that you could take, is essentially adding all your source columns or using the auto map to map fields that already exist in the source to your output. But anyway, so we've created our customer ID column. What I want to do is actually start mapping my customer ID. And again, what we're going to do is use the open bracket, and then we can select from another source that has that customer ID field. So I'm going to select from sales order header, grab that attribute, and we can actually see the relation path in here. And that is the only path that I have available. So otherwise this would be a drop down and I could select a different path to use. I'm going to save that. And again, we're going to do the same thing in here. And so we're just going to map, and both sales order header and customer already have that field. Okay, and then we're going to add one more column. And this is actually going to be the store ID. So we'll save this. Okay, and the new column gets added to the end. So we're just going to click one more page over. And then what we're actually going to do in here is map from use the relation from our customer source to get that store ID where the field exists. And again, we can see the relation path get built out, where this time we're taking 2 hops. We're going from sales order detail to sales order header, and then sales order header to customer. So let's save this. And then again, just map each of these fields. Oops. So grabbing from customer, we're doing store ID. And then let's do one more here. So this dot store ID, and save that. Okay, and so now I have all the columns that I want, and I have them all mapped the way that I want them to. Now, one more kind of set of settings or filters, if you will, is each channel. If we open the mapping again, you probably saw this earlier, but each channel has its own set of filters that we can include. So if we're looking at sales order detail, the include rows is what we're going to focus on for right now. So actually, what I'm going to do is open this in a second tab and go to our rules here. So we can see the validation rule that's already created here. And essentially this validation, I've set it so that if the expression is false, otherwise, if the order quantity is less than 1, or it's 1 or less than 1, we're going to mark that record as false. And so when we mark it as false, what do we want it to do? So we set it to warn, fail, or ignore it. I set it to fail. So when I'm actually looking at my channel settings, I'll see the include rows option here, and that's really referring to all those validation rules that we have on the source. And so right now, any records that do not pass that validation are not going to get included in this output. And that's actually what I want. So I'm going to leave that. However, if I did want to include all those records, I could just add this failed option, and that would allow all those records to be written through. Now, another filter that you have available just for all other types of rules is you can also reference any other attribute or rule you want to further filter down the data set that you're actually going to write out to your output location. So in this case, we could also add a filter that says, line total is greater than 0. So, obviously a lot of options, a lot of ways to customize the filters on your output. So we'll save that. And like I said, that does exist on every channel that you map in here. So what we'll do is just go through and actually reset all of our output channels here. So a couple different options. Again, we can just go through and reset each channel from the output page. And those will kick off. We'll let those kind of start running. The other option is if we went back to sales order detail, again, we could use that header level menu and actually reset all of the different outputs that we have this source mapped to at once, right? So we have each different channel. We have the OBT going to Databricks, we have the file, and then we have the Snowflake. So we could reset each individual channel, or we could reset all channels. And again, if you reset it from the source, it's essentially like doing this where you grab the specific channel menu and reset only that channel. So let's take a look at the process tab and just wait for these to complete. Okay, awesome. So it looks like all of our outputs, all of our output channels that we reset have completed successfully. Again, we could take a look at our output query here. So again, this is going to be tied to a specific channel. So each output query is going to be slightly different, but very much the same just based on the target schema. Now that we've got that up and running, let's take a look at Databricks and actually just double check that our output made it all the way through. So again, we're pulling from the Unity test, default schema database, and then the OBT sales table. So we just had to wait a second for our compute to get up and running, and now we should see the table. Perfect. So we can see all of our different columns. We can see all the different attributes that we've mapped to those columns, and then we can also see each of the different channels of outputs that we have here. Okay, so one way we can quickly identify each of those different channels is with this S output source ID column. So if we just change our query slightly, we can actually get a count by each of those output source IDs. So we'll do group by S output source ID, and we'll run that. And that should actually give us a tally here, which we can see. So we see that S output source ID 844, 845, 846, and then we see each of the record counts. And the reason I say this is it can be helpful to kind of validate or troubleshoot different outputs. This is actually the ID of the channel. So again, you see 844, 845, 846. That will always be included in this output. So you can actually identify records based on their channel ID as well, which is this as output source ID. Okay, so now that we've got, again, our successful output, one last thing that I want to show you in this video is actually just a slightly different scenario. So if we go to a different project, I have one kind of set up just to show you. But when we're actually working with Struct, so complex data types, which I have in this source right here, which is store large. I've got this attribute that's store, and we see the raw metadata. It's a struct with a bunch of different subfields. When we actually use this in an output, let's just create a test one. So we'll call struct output for demo purposes. We'll just do it as a virtual output, and then save this. So now when I actually go map that field, Let's just do the add all source columns first. We can see that DataForge does support complex data types such as array and struct in our output mappings. So we've got that in here. We can see the store as a struct in here. Now, there's a couple different tools that you can use for structs, just because it varies, right? They could be really complex, it could be really simple. But just one kind of quick one is if you added a new column and you were mapping that column, when you're actually working in this mapping, you can actually use dot notation within the struct. So let's say it's, you're grabbing the store field. If you add another dot or period, you can actually grab subfields within that struct as well. So just kind of a helpful little hint here. And then one other setting to know about structs is within store here. Because this is our struct field, there is going to be an expand button that will essentially, when you click this, it's going to create additional columns within your output that represent each of the subfields within the struct. And so it'll do that dot notation mapping for you. So you can do that within the actual mapping itself. The other place that you can do this is in the channel menu. You can actually use this expand all structs option, and that will actually do that same thing for you, where it's going to create additional columns for each of those subfields within the struct. So that's how you might work with outputs that include complex data types like structs and arrays. So that's everything about how output mappings work, how you could create different output connections, how you would map your different sources to different outputs. Again, just as a reminder, one source can be mapped to many different outputs, and many different sources can be mapped to one output. So it's a many-to-many relation, extremely flexible and very easy to use. And hopefully this video helped you kind of get adjusted to how to create your outputs within your DataForge workspace. Thanks for watching.